Good morning, happy Friday. Back with the Friendship War. We are in chapter 26 called Consequences. At every big assembly, the lower grades sit down near the stage and the upper grades stack up towards the back of the auditorium. So, this is the first year I've ever sat in the very back row, and I have to say I like it back here. I feel sort of hidden. Mrs. Porter is on the stage, and the room gets quiet as she steps into the microphone. Good morning, girls and boys, and thank you for finding your seats in such a calm and orderly way. I've asked you here to talk about buttons. There's a quick buzz of chatter and a little bit of laughter, but Mrs. Porter shakes her head and frowns, and the auditorium goes silent again. Over the past week or so, so many of you have become very interested in buttons. But with almost every fad that finds its way to school, there comes a moment when the fad begins to get in the way of our work. And we have now reached that moment. Therefore, starting tomorrow morning, any buttons that are seen here at school will be taken away by your teachers and will be held for you until the end of the school year. And today, I expect any of you may have buttons here at school to take them home and leave them at home. Of course, I'm not talking about the buttons we all wear each day, but the buttons that are being traded and collected and used as toys and game pieces. So I'm going to say this again. I expect all of you who have buttons here at school today to take those buttons home with you this afternoon and leave them there. Please raise your hand now if you understand what I've just asked everyone to do. I put my hand up in the air, and so does every other kid in the auditorium. So that's it? My wish has come true? Mrs. Porter says the button fad is over. So it is, at least at school. You may put your hands down now, and thank you all very much. The auditorium is filled with a sudden buzz because every kid here knows that the assembly is over. Some of the younger kids down front even begin to stand up. Please, quiet, and take your seats. The room gets quiet, but not the same full silence as before, and it makes me wonder if anyone has ever done a scientific study about large groups of children all together in the same room. Because this makes me remember a nature show about bees that Grandpa and I watched, and how any little disturbance will go rippling right through a whole beehive. Mrs. Porter has more to say, but now the bees are restless. As many of you know, a very large quantity of buttons was found in our school playground on Wednesday. The one sentence sets off a burst of chatter, a lot of nodding, and a lot of reaching into pockets. That one sentence also makes my stomach tighten up into a knot. Ellie's sitting right next to me, and I'm afraid she's going to be able to hear my heart as it thumps inside my chest, my throat, my head. Quiet, please, everyone. Settle down. I know that a lot of you picked up buttons when you were outside yesterday, but there are still many left on the ground. After school, I walked around with our custodian and with the town employees who mow the grass. They are concerned that the buttons might damage the lawnmowers, and when they began mowing, several cars stopped to complain that bits of buttons had struck their cars as they drove past. I had to call the police and ask them to close off the street next to the playground until the mowing was finished. I'm trying to sit very still, trying not to breathe too fast, trying not to faint, trying not to jump out of my seat and run screaming from the auditorium. And Mrs. Porter keeps talking. After the mowing was finished, 2 police officers and I studied the school security video recordings from Tuesday night. We saw that someone came into the schoolyard not once or twice, but 4 times to throw buttons all over the field. It was dark when this happened, so it was impossible to identify the person who did this. The police department is now calling this a case of littering on public property, and they have opened an investigation. Any student who has information that might help the police should speak to a teacher or to me. A deep hush settles over the auditorium. Mrs. Porter lets the silence go on and on. My jaws clamped so tightly I feel like I might crush my teeth. Hank is sitting in the row ahead of me, about 3 seats to the left. I'm just praying that he doesn't turn around and wink or smile or give me a thumbs up. But he's too smart to do something like that. Actually, he's probably freaked out too. If you know about a crime, then you're just as guilty as the person who did it. Unless you tell. Finally, Mrs. Porter speaks. I want to thank you all for paying such careful attention this morning. The first graders may leave now, and everyone else, please remain seated until your teacher asks you to stand up. The auditorium begins to buzz again, and Ellie whispers, "Somebody's going to need a lawyer, or not. The fine for littering can't be a big deal, right? Maybe like $100 or something. Anyway, pretty exciting, don't you think?" My mouth is so dry I can barely talk. Yeah, it's exciting. But the correct word is terrifying. It's terrifying! I have never been in trouble at school before. Never been sent to the principal. Never had to stay after school. I can't even remember the last time a teacher yelled at me. And this is real trouble. The kind where parents have to come in for a meeting in the principal's office. And the police will be there. The police! As the slot slams into my skull, Hank turns around and catches my eye. I smile and try to look brave and calm, and totally fail. I don't know if Hank looks worried or sad or terrified, like me. But I know one thing for sure, I can't sit still for one more second. I whisper to Ellie, "See you in social studies." And then I stand up and scooch my way along the row of kids until I get to Mrs. Lang, who's standing in the aisle. "Mrs. Lang, may I go to the office? I don't feel well." Which is not a lie. I've never felt worse in my life. She stares into my face for a second, and I can see the flash of concern in her eyes. I must look awful. "Of course, go right ahead, Grace. Do you need someone to walk with you?" "No, I'll be okay, thanks." The halls are filled with 3rd and 4th graders leaving the auditorium, but I barely see them. I barely feel my feet on the tile floor. And when I get to the office, the door leading outside are just off to the right, and I feel like making a break for it, like a convict in a prison movie. But I don't. In the main office, the school secretary looks away from her computer screen and gives me a big smile. "Hi, Grace, what can I help you with?" In 2nd grade, and again in 4th, I got picked a lot whenever my teachers needed to send something to the office, because I was a such little girl back then. So I know Mrs. Sterling pretty well. "I have to talk with Mrs. Porter, please. She just came back from the assembly, and there's a busy morning ahead. Can this wait until lunchtime? Say about 12:15? I really have to talk to her now. It's about the buttons." Mrs. Sterling's eyebrows jump halfway up her forehead. "Oh, I see. Just sit over there on the bench, and I'll tell Mrs. Porter you are here." I looked into the office and seen kids sitting on the bench before, and I always felt sorry for them, and now I feel sorry for me. Mrs. Porter doors open, and she gives me a smile. "Good morning, Grace. Please come in and have a seat here at the table." It's a small round table on the left of her desk, and I take the chair facing the window that looks out at the bus turnaround. Mrs. Porter sits across from me. She's not a scary person. She reminds me of Mom's friend Carla. Warm, friendly, nice smile. Miss Porter is wearing a gray wool skirt and jacket with a pale blue shirt. And right away I start counting the buttons. I can't help myself. "So you wanted to see me, right?" Before I can answer, there's a knock at the door, and Mrs. Sterling opens it and sticks her head outside. "Sorry to interrupt." She walks over and bends down and whispers something to the principal's ear. At that time, Mrs. Porter's eyebrows that go shooting upward. She looks at me and says, "It seems that we need more chairs at our table." I'm confused, and Mrs. Porter is on her feet getting chairs. I look over at the doorway, and suddenly I'm really confused. Because 2 kids walk into the office and sit down. Hank Powell on my right, and Ellie Emerson on my left. Chapter 27, Deal. All my logic, all the ability to reason and think like a scientist. None of that is working, but I feel like I have to say something anyway, so I say it fast. "Mrs. Porter, I don't know what Ellie and Hank are doing here, because they didn't have anything to do with those buttons outside on the playground. I put them there by myself, and it was totally my idea, so they shouldn't even be here at all." She looks from Hank to Ellie. "Is that true? That Grace put those buttons on the playground completely by herself?" They both nod, and Miss Porter says, "Then it seems like this matter is between Grace and me and her parents. So why are you here? Hank, you first." "We're here because we're witnesses. Grace wasn't littering. She was just giving away a lot of buttons, and the only reason she was doing that was to try to stop the fad, which is the same thing you wanted, right?" "And how do you happen to know all this?" "Because yesterday I went over to Grace's house after school, and she told me she was the one who put the buttons on the field, and she explained why she did it. It was an experiment about supply and demand, because if the supply of something goes up, then the demand for it is supposed to go down. And she wanted the demand for buttons to go all the way down to 0. So the fad would be over, and when I saw Grace heading for the office a few minutes ago, I told Ellie everything, and here we are. Mrs. Porter looks at me. Why did you want the fad to end? Ellie raises her hand and starts talking before I can say a word. So, I've been best friends with Grace ever since 2nd grade, but last week, we got into an argument about this pretty button that we both wanted. And Grace traded for it before I could. So then I was really mean to her, and she was really mean back to me. And it kept getting worse and worse and worse. And we were both miserable at everything. But then, Grace decided to actually do something to make the whole button thing go away, so that we could be friends again. And that's why it wasn't littering. Mrs. Porter starts to say something, but Hank jumps in again. And Ellie, Grace, and I will go over the whole playground every day after school, and we'll keep on working until every single button out there is picked up. Mrs. Porter shakes her head. Actually, that won't be necessary. After mowing yesterday, the crew went back over the area with the leaf vacuum, and there are hardly any buttons left. Ellie says, then Hank, Grace, and I will chip in. We'll pay for the extra time it took them to vacuum up the buttons, and we'll also pay what it costs to have the police close off the street during mowing. How about that? Is it a deal? Can we shake on it? Ellie leans forward and puts her hand out toward Mrs. Porter. Then Hank puts out his hand, and so do I. And Mrs. Porter? She's surprised. But she smiles and shakes with each of us, Ellie, Hank, and then me. Except after we shake, she keeps a hold of my hand. I'll call the police department, and after I explain, I'll ask them to drop their investigation. That ought to be the end of it. I can't keep my eyes from filling up. Thanks, Mrs. Porter. She nods at Ellie and Hank. They're the ones that you should thank. It's great to have one good friend, but you have two looking out for you? That's nothing short of wonderful. Now go ask Mrs. Sterling for passes and get back to class, and have a happy day. We're out of the office in less than a minute, walking together toward the 6th grade hall. And with Ellie on my left and Hank on my right, I have to agree with Mrs. Porter. This is nothing short of wonderful. All right, I'll be back on Monday to probably finish this up. We're about done. Have a great Friday and have a great weekend.